Darkness often hides itself in plain sight, woven into the daily lives of families that outwardly appear respectable, yet behind their closed doors, they nurture traditions drenched in unspeakable acts. History is filled with stories that make us question how such horrors could go unnoticed, and sometimes the most terrifying truths come not from folklore or ghost tales, but from the families who lived among us. In the rural lands of 19th century Illinois, there existed a family whose legacy was whispered about but rarely confronted directly. A family that turned intimacy into a grotesque performance of power, control, and blood. Their practices were not just scandalous, they were depraved to a level that blurred the line between ritual and perversion, leaving behind stories that still send shivers through the soil they once called home. The Smith family appeared to be one of those households that fit neatly into the rhythm of small-town Illinois in the mid-1800s, the kind of family that attended church services on Sunday, tilled their land diligently, and exchanged polite nods with neighbors when they ventured into town for supplies. To the passing eye, they gave no reason for suspicion, their lives seemingly built on the pillars of respectability, routine, and rural piety. Yet hidden within the walls of their farmhouse was a reality far darker than anyone could imagine, a hidden world that thrived precisely because of the image they projected. This facade of ordinary decency was their most effective weapon, allowing their depravity to grow unchecked while their neighbors went on believing they were no different from any other hard-working family of the time. The power of such a disguise was in its simplicity, for no one wanted to believe that evil could thrive so close to home. No one wanted to consider that the polite nod and Sunday hymn could mask something unspeakable. The family's concealment of their practices was not accidental but carefully cultivated. The patriarch ensured his children knew how to smile appropriately when passing others on the road, how to speak with humility and avoid drawing unnecessary attention, and how to recite passages of scripture with convincing reverence. These outward signs of morality created a shield, and as long as they maintained it, suspicion could never gain a foothold. Inside the home, however, the atmosphere changed dramatically once the door was closed and the eyes of the outside world were shut away. The walls themselves seemed to hold secrets, every wooden beam absorbing the cries and twisted rituals that unfolded within, each echo of the family's activities sinking into the structure until the house felt less like a dwelling and more like a vessel for corruption. Neighbors remembered that the Smith family rarely allowed outsiders too far into their home. Visitors were kept confined to the front parlor, a room kept spotless, adorned with a Bible prominently displayed on the mantel, and a set of chairs arranged neatly for guests. Behind closed doors, however, the rest of the home was arranged to suit their horrific needs. Bedrooms were not sanctuaries of rest, but chambers where boundaries between blood relatives blurred, and lines of morality were deliberately erased. These rooms became theaters where acts cloaked as familial bonding were carried out with a perverse pride, acts that not only violated the innocence of the younger, but were presented as obligations, as traditions essential to maintaining family loyalty. This dual existence, the clean, upright public image and the secret horrors within, was what allowed the Smith family to endure for so long without exposure. They knew that society at the time was slow to pry into private affairs, that accusations without evidence could destroy reputations unjustly, and that the rural isolation of Illinois farmland offered them further protection. Their farmland stretched out wide enough that the cries from within were drowned out by the winds passing over fields of corn and wheat, and the remoteness ensured that no curious eyes lingered too long. This isolation became a weapon, shielding them from accountability while tightening their grip over one another, because within those walls there was no escape, no watchful eye to intervene, only the family and its suffocating set of rules. For the Smiths, respectability was not only a shield, but a stage upon which they played their roles to perfection. The father was seen as a figure of discipline, the mother as a silent but pious woman, the children as obedient and polite, yet none of these identities reflected the truth of what happened when the doors were closed. The very idea of decency was weaponized, used to dismiss even the faintest whisper of odd behavior. If a neighbor remarked on a child's distant look or unusual silence, it was quickly excused as shyness or the natural reserve of farm children. If someone wondered why the family rarely hosted gatherings, it was brushed aside with explanations about hard work and limited time. Every suspicion had its pre-prepared answer, and those answers were given with such quiet conviction that people accepted them without pressing further. The terrifying brilliance of the Smith family lay in their ability to blend into the moral fabric of their community, to appear not only ordinary but exemplary. They participated in prayer circles, offered donations to the church, and even extended small kindnesses to neighbors, all while ensuring that no one could ever connect them with the corruption they practiced in private. It was as though they wore two masks, one for the world outside, painted with piety and respect, and another for the interior of their home, where the most grotesque acts were normalized and repeated. The children learned early that survival depended on this duality, that to speak or hint at the truth would bring wrath not only from their father, but from the entire family structure, which demanded loyalty above all else. By cloaking themselves in respectability, the Smiths demonstrated one of the most chilling truths about human depravity, that the most monstrous acts often hide not in the shadows of obvious suspicion, but in the spaces where trust is assumed, where outward appearances lull others into comfort. Their horror was not the kind that crept through forests or haunted graveyards, but the kind that lived quietly within a house that looked no different from any other. This disguise made them untouchable, and it allowed their practices to continue unseen and unchallenged for far longer than they should have. The Smith family's twisted way of life was rooted in a set of beliefs that they convinced themselves were righteous, beliefs that warped religion and loyalty into tools of control. What might have begun as the patriarch's indulgence in forbidden desires gradually transformed into a structured system of practices justified under the guise of devotion and duty. They took the language of scripture, the cadence of prayer, and the authority of religious ritual, twisting them until words meant to inspire faith became weapons used to enforce submission. To an outsider, the Smiths would speak in terms of piety and sacrifice, but within their household, those same words became shackles that bound every member into obedience. This distortion of belief was not accidental, but deliberate, a strategy to strip away resistance by making the horrific seem holy, by convincing the family that what they endured was not only acceptable, but required. The father, who positioned himself as both leader and prophet within the home, carefully selected passages from the Bible, plucking out verses that could be misinterpreted to support his dominance. He wove sermons during mealtimes, using the rhythm of a preacher's voice to make his demands sound like divine instructions. The children, raised with no other authority than his, were unable to see the difference between faith and fear. Their mother, equally trapped, enforced the rules by reinforcing his words, presenting their acts as rituals of loyalty that brought them closer to God. Through repetition and fear of punishment, these distortions took root in the minds of the younger ones until they no longer questioned why their bodies and souls were offered up in such unnatural ways. To them, this was not abuse, it was duty, and duty was survival. This belief system became a living doctrine within the house, one that shaped every detail of their existence. Meals were not simply times of nourishment, but gatherings where lectures on purity and sacrifice were delivered. Chores around the farm were framed as acts of cleansing, metaphors for washing away sin, though the true sins lay at the heart of the family's practices. Even the architecture of the house began to reflect this ideology, with spaces dedicated to rituals that blurred the line between religious ceremony and grotesque indulgence. Rooms were stripped of comfort, leaving them bare save for candles, a wooden cross, and whatever instruments the father deemed necessary to carry out his version of devotion. It was in these spaces that the children learned to associate pain with prayer, obedience with holiness, and silence with survival. The more the Smiths indulged in these practices, the more convinced they became of their own twisted righteousness. The patriarch believed he was chosen to lead his family into a higher form of spiritual existence, one that required sacrifice not of animals or wealth, but of flesh, loyalty, and shame. This narrative was reinforced constantly until each act of horror was cloaked in a justification that erased its brutality. The mother, indoctrinated as thoroughly as her children, played a critical role in sustaining this narrative. Her silence was not simply fear, but a belief that she too was fulfilling a divine role by ensuring that no one defied the structure of their household. In this way, belief was not only distorted, but weaponized, turning every family member into both victim and enforcer. Such beliefs did not remain locked inside rituals, but seeped into the everyday language and behavior of the Smith children. When they spoke to outsiders, they often referenced duty, purity, and obedience with an intensity that seemed unusual, but not alarming enough to raise suspicion. Their eyes, however, carried a distant look, a reflection of lives lived in contradiction, where love was promised through acts of violence and loyalty was demanded through humiliation. Their faith was not one of hope or salvation, but of endurance, a distorted religion that allowed them to endure the unbearable because they believed it was ordained. The horror of the Smith family lay not only in the acts themselves, but in how they managed to cloak them under the mantle of belief. When outsiders might have seen a family clinging to their faith in an isolated farmhouse, the reality was far more sinister. Every hymn sung in their parlor carried an undertone of corruption. Every prayer before a meal was another reminder of submission, and every whispered blessing was a cover for acts that no scripture could ever justify. This ability to transform devotion into depravity created an unshakable cycle where resistance seemed impossible, because to resist meant to defy not only the family, but God himself, at least as he was presented to them. In the darkness of their home, these distorted beliefs became the air they breathed, an invisible poison that ensured no one questioned the structure. It created a hierarchy where the father's word was divine law, the mother's compliance was sanctified obedience, and the children's suffering was framed as holy sacrifice. And in that structure, the Smith family carved out a legacy of horror so deeply interwoven with faith that even the victims themselves could not always separate sin from salvation, pain from devotion, or family from fear. The cycle of horror within the Smith family did not confine itself to one generation, but stretched its claws into the lives of those who came after, as if corruption itself had become an heirloom passed down alongside the farm, the land, and the family name. What began as the depravity of the patriarch soon hardened into tradition, a ritualized pattern that each child was taught not only to endure, but eventually to perpetuate. The most chilling aspect was not simply the abuse itself, but how it was normalized, how it became woven into the fabric of the family's identity, so that those who grew up under its shadow saw no way to separate themselves from it. For them, it was not a matter of questioning whether the practices were wrong, but of learning how to continue them, how to ensure that the cycle of loyalty, submission, and corruption remained unbroken. The children, broken from an early age, were molded into both victims and participants. They were taught that obedience was love, that silence was strength, and that the family's secret rituals were not shameful, but sacred. By the time they reached adolescence, their resistance had been eroded by years of conditioning, until they themselves began to enforce the very practices that had once terrified them. Older siblings oversaw the younger, repeating the distorted sermons of their father, using the same language of faith and duty that had been used against them. What had once been inflicted became tradition, an inheritance of torment that each generation was expected to accept without question. This generational corruption did not need chains or locks to bind them. The weight of expectation and indoctrination was enough. The most disturbing element of this legacy was the pride with which it was sometimes carried. The father convinced his children that their way of life elevated them above others, that the rituals they endured and performed made them stronger, purer, closer to the divine than their neighbors who lived ordinary lives. He painted outsiders as weak, blind to the truths that only the Smiths possessed, and this sense of superiority became a poisoned crown passed down to each generation. Children raised under such teaching often looked upon the townsfolk with a mix of disdain and pity, convinced that what they endured in secret marked them as chosen, even as their bodies and spirits bore the scars of it. This corruption became so deeply rooted that even when the original patriarch grew old, his influence lingered in the children who had by then internalized his words and methods. They no longer needed his voice to guide them. It lived on in their own, echoing in their minds whenever they enacted the rituals he had once commanded. His death, rather than breaking the cycle, only cemented it, because by then the family had absorbed his teachings into the marrow of their existence. The Smith household did not falter but carried on, each new generation growing up beneath the same roof of silence and obedience, repeating the same patterns as though they were reciting prayers passed down through time. Even those who tried to resist found themselves ensnared. Some of the Smith children, upon reaching adulthood, longed for escape, yearning for lives free from the weight of secrecy and horror. Yet the moment they considered leaving, the chains of indoctrination pulled them back. Fear of divine punishment, fear of betraying their family, and fear of the unknown beyond the farm kept them rooted in place. On the rare occasions when one did manage to slip away, They carried the scars with them, unable to fully sever themselves from the past. Their silence became another form of inheritance, for even in freedom they could not speak, unable to confess the truth without tearing apart their identity. Generational corruption also seeped into the way the family treated outsiders. As children became adults and bore children of their own, the rituals expanded to include new victims, binding them into the same cycle. Marriages within the family were arranged not to escape the horror, but to strengthen it, ensuring that every new life born into the household was caught in the web from the moment they took their first breath. It was not simply abuse, it was architecture, a carefully constructed system designed to perpetuate itself indefinitely. What made this legacy particularly haunting was its invisibility to the outside world. Neighbors saw children grow into adults, adults into parents, and parents into elders, never realizing that what looked like a continuation of family tradition was actually the perpetuation of a nightmare. Generational corruption thrives in silence, and the Smiths were masters of silence. They did not need to hide their horrors from one another because they had convinced themselves that nothing was wrong. The real performance was for outsiders, and they played their parts flawlessly. The Smith family's story reveals how horror can evolve into heritage, how the unspeakable can become normalized when it is wrapped in the language of duty and passed down as tradition. With each new generation, the cycle deepened, the line between victim and perpetrator blurred, until the family itself became less a collection of individuals and more an institution of corruption, a legacy that ensured their darkness would outlive them, continuing in whispers, rituals, and bloodlines long after the first seeds of depravity had been planted. The Smith family's chosen home in rural Illinois gave them not only land to farm and a roof over their heads, but also the perfect veil of isolation behind which their horrors could thrive unchecked. In the mid-1800s, isolation was both a reality and a weapon. Families lived miles apart. Neighbors might only meet during church gatherings or market days, and the silence of the prairie often swallowed cries that might otherwise have drawn attention in a more crowded town. The Smiths used this remoteness to their advantage, creating an environment where secrecy was not only possible, but almost guaranteed. The farmhouse stood like a lone sentinel in the fields, its walls hiding unspeakable practices, while the winds carried away any sound that might have escaped. The family could live in two worlds at once, publicly respectable and privately monstrous, their remote setting ensuring that no outsider ever came too close. Within this isolation, control was absolute. The patriarch understood that without external influences, his children and wife would have no frame of reference beyond what he allowed them to know. By keeping them confined to the farm, discouraging visits with neighbors, and limiting exposure to the outside world, he created a self-contained universe where his distorted rules were law. There were no comparisons to be made, no alternative lives to glimpse, and no chance encounters that might awaken doubt. This control was psychological as much as it was physical, instilling in the family the belief that the world beyond their fields was dangerous, corrupt, and filled with people who would never understand their ways. In such conditions, escape did not merely mean stepping away from abuse, it meant stepping into a world painted as hostile and alien. The land itself seemed to conspire in the family's concealment. The dirt roads that wound toward the Smith farm were rarely traveled, and visitors often found the journey daunting, particularly during harsh winters when snow blocked paths, or in wet seasons when mud swallowed wagon wheels. The remoteness discouraged curiosity, and the Smiths used this distance to keep others at bay. Deliveries were rare, trade minimal, and social calls practically non-existent. When townsfolk wondered why the family kept so much to themselves, they excused it as simple self-sufficiency, the rugged independence often praised in rural life. Yet behind that independence was a deliberate strategy to isolate the family from prying eyes, to ensure that the walls of the farmhouse remained the only world its members would ever truly know. Inside the home, this isolation deepened into captivity. Children raised without exposure to outsiders grew up believing that their family's rituals were universal, that every household behind closed doors carried out the same acts of loyalty and sacrifice. When no one is allowed to see differently, the impossible begins to feel ordinary. The mother, too, became ensnared in this environment, her silence fortified by the knowledge that no help was coming from beyond their fields. Without relatives visiting, without neighbors stepping too far onto their land, there was no one to witness her submission or the suffering of her children. The farmhouse became less a place of living and more a prison crafted with invisible bars, where the very remoteness of the land ensured obedience. The father's use of control extended to time as well as space. He structured every moment of the day, from dawn's first chores to the evening rituals that blurred the line between religious observance and depravity. There was no idle moment in which the children might wander into freedom of thought, no space for unsupervised curiosity that might plant a seed of rebellion. By monopolizing their time, he tightened his grip further, ensuring that the isolation of the farm was mirrored by an isolation within the mind. They were trained to associate his presence with safety, his words with truth, and his rituals with necessity, leaving them unable to imagine a life beyond what was prescribed. Isolation also meant there was no safe path of escape. The distances between farms were long and treacherous, and a child fleeing the Smith household had little chance of surviving the journey without being caught or perishing from exposure. Even the thought of running away was discouraged by tales of wolves in the forests, of bandits on the roads, and of starvation in the wilderness. These warnings, whether true or exaggerated, served as barriers more effective than any locked door. To the children, the outside world was not a place of salvation, but a death trap, and so they remained bound to the only life they knew, their captivity ensured not by walls but by fear. What made the Smiths' isolation most terrifying was how normal it appeared from afar. To the few neighbors who occasionally passed by, the farmhouse looked unremarkable. Smoke rising from the chimney, livestock grazing in the fields, crops planted in neat rows. There was no sign of the rot within, no visible evidence of the rituals that unfolded in the darkness of night. The silence of isolation was not only physical, but communal, for in those days it was considered impolite to pry into another family's private life. This cultural restraint further shielded the Smiths, allowing them to persist in their horrors without challenge. The combination of remoteness and control created a perfect storm of secrecy, a sealed environment where the patriarch's will was absolute and the cycle of abuse could thrive uninterrupted. The family's isolation did not simply protect their secrets from outsiders. It cemented those secrets as unbreakable truths within the minds of the children, who grew up unable to separate their father's twisted demands from the reality of the world itself. In this way, the isolation of the Illinois prairie became more than geography. It became a tool of horror, a silent accomplice in ensuring that the Smith family's darkness remained locked away behind closed doors, unseen and unchallenged for years on end. Even after the Smith family had faded from the records of Illinois, their presence lingered in the whispers of those who lived nearby, as though the soil itself had absorbed the memory of what had been done upon it. Locals began to speak of the family not as ordinary farmers who had once tilled the land, but as something darker, an unclean mark upon the community's past. Stories were passed down in hushed voices, often around fires on cold nights when the prairie wind rattled windows and children pressed closer to their parents. They spoke of cries that still echoed faintly from the abandoned farmhouse, of candlelight flickering through broken shutters when no one lived there, of shadows moving across the fields long after the family was gone. To many, it was not the spirits of the dead that haunted the land, but the memory of the acts themselves, as though the very earth could not forget what had seeped into it. The legacy of the Smith family was not merely historical, but folkloric. Each retelling of their story carried a slightly different edge, shaped by the fears and imaginations of those who remembered. Some said the patriarch had struck a deal with dark forces, that his rituals were not only perverse but sacrificial, binding his family to a curse that could never be lifted. Others whispered that the house itself was alive, that the wooden beams had absorbed too much sin, and that anyone who stepped inside would feel the weight of unseen eyes watching. Parents used the Smiths as cautionary tales, warning their children never to wander too far from home, never to trust too easily in the smiles of neighbors, for behind any closed door might lurk a family just as cursed. The name became a symbol not only of one family's evil, but of the hidden darkness that could lie within any community. Farmers who inherited nearby plots often refused to work the land closest to the old Smith property. They claimed their tools broke too easily there, their animals grew restless, and crops failed without explanation. Even those who did not believe in curses admitted that something about the land felt wrong, as though the sunlight itself dimmed over those fields. At night, travelers avoided the path that led past the ruins of the farmhouse, telling of strange sounds in the tall grass and of a suffocating silence that pressed upon them as they passed. Some who ventured too close spoke of feeling a chill that lingered in their bones, a heaviness that followed them home, as though the land itself resented being disturbed. These whispers became part of the cultural memory of the region, a lingering reminder that evil is not always buried with the dead. The Smith family may have vanished from census records and church logs, but they lived on in rumor, shaping the way people thought about isolation, secrecy, and the dangers of unchecked power. Their story seeped into sermons as warnings against sin, into bedtime stories meant to keep children obedient, into local legends that gave shape to the nameless fears of a community that could never quite put the past to rest. Even those who scoffed at the tales could not deny that something lingered, an unease that refused to dissipate no matter how many years passed. What made the legacy particularly haunting was how ordinary the family had seemed while they lived. That realization, that horror could grow inside a home that looked no different from any other, haunted the imagination more than any ghost. The Smiths became a symbol of hidden corruption, of the danger that lurked not in distant legends or foreign lands, but in the house down the road, behind a neighbor's smile, within a family that claimed piety while hiding unspeakable acts. This idea embedded itself into the folklore, transforming the Smiths into more than just a historical family. They became archetypes of the evil that can disguise itself as ordinary life. As the years rolled on, their story evolved into something larger than fact. The boundaries between truth and legend blurred, until even historians could not fully separate what had truly occurred from what had been exaggerated in the retelling. Some said descendants of the Smiths still walked among the townsfolk, carrying the curse of their ancestors in their blood. Others insisted that every so often, a new family that settled on the land would vanish without explanation, their belongings left behind as though they had been swallowed whole by the earth. Whether true or not, these tales gave shape to the fear that the Smiths' influence had not ended with their deaths, that corruption of such magnitude could never be fully erased. In time, the name Smith became a word spoken with unease, a reminder of a darkness too great to ignore yet too terrible to confront directly. The family's story lived on not in written records but in the mouths of storytellers, passed from one generation to the next, each version carrying the same essential truth, that what happened behind the closed doors of the Smith farmhouse had stained more than the family itself. It had tainted the land, unsettled the community, and carved out a place in history where memory and nightmare coiled together, ensuring that the horrors of the Smith family would never truly be forgotten.